ever get that feeling like your house is kind of messing with you? You put your keys down in the same spot every day and then poof, they're gone.
Oh, yeah.
Like, hello, did they just sprout legs and walk away?
Yeah.
Or how about that sock monster in the dryer?
Yeah. The dryer eats them.
That's got to be a poltergeist, right? No, maybe.
Hmm.
Today we're diving into a case that really put poltergeists on the map.
The Enfield Poltergeist.
You got it. And we've got two great sources to unpack. A YouTube documentary from BTWN Paranormal lays out the timeline and the eyewitness accounts.
Right. And we've got a peoplea.com article that adds another layer with some more recent reflections and direct quotes.
So picture this. North London, Enfield, 1977. Regular council house. Single mom Peggy Hodgson raising 4 kids. Life seems pretty normal. Until August of that year, when things take a seriously spooky turn.
Yeah, August is when it all started.
So our mission, as always, is to really explore the core mysteries of Enfield. What happened, who said what. From the cops to the reporters, we've wade through some of the skeptical takes.
Debunk some stuff.
Exactly. We want to give you all the info so you can decide for yourself.
That's right. We're all about informed, spooky fun.
So let's start with the beginning. August 30th, 1977, 11-year-old Janet and her brother, Peter, reported their beds were wobbling.
Classic poltergeist move, right?
Yeah, like the beds were doing the jitterbug or something.
Pretty much. Now, Mom, Peggy Hodgson, probably thought they were just messing around. I mean, kids, right?
I would have thought the same thing. Go to sleep. But the next night, things got real.
August 31st.
It was like the poltergeist was saying, hold my beer.
Yeah, it decided to level up. Around 9:30 p.m., Peggy hears this huge crash from the kids' room.
Mom's like, not this again.
I know, right? But then she sees the chest of drawers moving on its own.
And not just like inching along. It was like trying to trap the girls in the room.
Totally. The People article even quotes Janet remembering her mom saying, "Oh, don't be silly." Classic mom response. But then Peggy saw it with her own eyes.
And she tried to push the chest back, but it just wouldn't budge. The documentary really emphasizes how much she struggled with it. Imagine you're wrestling furniture, and there's nothing there.
I'd be out of there. But Peggy called for help.
The neighbors, Vic and Peggy Nottingham, heard the commotion and came over. And Vic even heard weird noises coming from the house.
So we've got multiple witnesses now, and it gets even better. Or, I guess, creepier, depending on how you look at it. They actually called the cops.
I mean, what else do you do when your furniture has gone rogue?
Exactly. The documentary goes into detail about this. 2 officers show up. At first, nothing happens. They're probably thinking it's a waste of time.
Another day, another weird call, right? But then, boom, a big armchair in the living room decides to take a little walk.
Like a good 4 feet across the floor, totally unassisted.
A policewoman actually gave a statement saying she saw this chair levitate. She even checked under it to make sure there weren't any strings or tricks.
That's pretty hard to dismiss, a cop witnessing a levitating chair. But the police were like, well, no law's broken.
No crime, no time, right?
Exactly. But the weirdness just kept on coming. For the next 3 days, there were reports of Lego bricks and marbles flying around. And get this, they were hot to the touch.
What?
Yeah, the heat is a detail that really stands out in the documentary. It makes you think there's some kind of energy involved.
Yeah, not your average everyday haunting.
Not at all. The family was so freaked out, they actually reached out to a vicar and a local medium for help.
Trying anything to stop the house from throwing stuff at them.
Totally. But sadly, no dice.
The documentary mentions that little Janet actually called the poltergeist polka dice. I mean, it's kind of cute, but also sad,
Yeah. And the documentary paints this picture of utter chaos. You've got reports from other relatives saying they saw chairs twisting in midair, a kid getting thrown from a chair.
It's like the house was throwing a tantrum.
It really was. And the documentary talks about the typical script of a poltergeist. It starts with knocking sounds, then small objects start flying, then it escalates to furniture going crazy.
Yeah, and this one definitely followed the script.
For sure. And the family was obviously terrified. The documentary keeps coming back to them saying, why us? They felt totally helpless.
Right, like they had been chosen for this paranormal house party and they didn't RSVP.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the documentary mentions this theory that poltergeists are often linked to tension within a family. They even mention that Janet's parents had split up, which could have been a contributing factor.
I guess the divorce is pretty tense.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if the emotional energy of the situation was somehow feeding the poltergeist.
Now, another important thing the documentary explains is the difference between a haunting and a poltergeist. A haunting is usually tied to a location, like a specific house or
But
building.
like the house itself is haunted.
Yeah, and they can last for a long time. But a poltergeist is usually focused on a person.
Like Janet in this case.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And poltergeists tend to be short-lived. So the fact that Enfield went on for 14 months is pretty unusual. It's like the poltergeist overstayed its welcome.
Yeah. This one was determined to make its presence known.
So we've got the family living in a haunted house. What do they do next? Call Ghostbusters.
Sadly, no Ghostbusters back then, but they did call the press.
Of course they did. I mean, wouldn't you?
September 4th, 1977, the Hodgsons reach out to the Daily Mirror. The documentary actually quotes the night news editor being pretty dismissive at first.
They probably thought it was a hoax or something.
Yeah, but the neighbors kept calling back, insisting it was real.
Persistence pays off. So they send reporter Doug Benson and photographer Graham Morris to check it out. And they were pretty skeptical, which is understandable.
Right, they weren't about to believe everything they heard, but as they were about to leave, things started happening.
The poltergeist put on a show.
It did. Graham Morris actually got hit in the face by a Lego brick, right above the eye. Yeah, and the documentary says it left a mark. Suddenly, they weren't just skeptical reporters anymore, they were part of the story.
Talk about a close encounter. So now the Daily Mirror was taking things seriously. They contacted the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research,
The big guns.
and enter Maurice Grosse.
A legend in the paranormal world. The documentary describes him as an inventor with a handlebar mustache who drove an E-type Jaguar.
Stylish ghost hunter.
That's him.
Oh,
But despite the flash, he was really thorough. He interviewed the family, tried to rule out normal explanations, and then he started experiencing the weird stuff himself.
Poltergeist decided to show off for him.
It did. Lego bricks and marbles flying around. But the marbles didn't bounce when they landed, which is weird. And then furniture moving like a huge three-piece suite getting flipped over.
So now we've got the neighbors, the cops, reporters, and the SPR investigators all saying the same thing. This house is haunted.
It definitely seemed that way. Girls even tried communicating with the poltergeist by tapping back when it made knocking sounds.
Like a ghostly game of knock-knock. Who's there?
Exactly. But not everyone was convinced. The documentary includes this journalist, Ian Banks, who was pretty skeptical. He heard moaning sounds and thought Janet was just, well,
Let's keep it PG.
Yeah, let's just say he had a less than supernatural explanation.
And then there's the photographic evidence.
Yeah.
The documentary talks about how photographer Graham Morris set up his camera in Janet's room to catch something on film.
He got some really interesting photos. Bedclothes levitating, curtains wrapping around the bed cover.
Pretty spooky stuff. But as the documentary points out, even Morris admitted that the photos might not be convincing to people who weren't there. It's hard to capture this stuff on film.
You really have to experience it firsthand. And speaking of firsthand experience, another key player arrives.
Guy Lyon Playfair.
Another SPR investigator, but he'd actually written books about paranormal phenomena.
So he's coming in with some serious knowledge.
Yeah, he was pretty experienced. And the documentary even mentions how he seemed to anticipate certain events, like he knew what the poltergeist was going to do next.
That's kind of creepy. But the documentary doesn't shy away from the chaos of this whole situation. The girls were losing sleep, struggling in school. It was taking a toll on the whole family.
Of course. And people started questioning Mrs. Hodgson's motives. Some thought she was just trying to get a better house.
Drama.
Right. But the documentary says she denied it. And then there's the whole question of whether the girls were faking some of it.
Maybe they were just bored and wanted to spice things up a bit.
Well, Janet later admitted to faking things once or twice.
Busted.
But both Playfair and Grosse still believed there were real phenomena happening. They said that the girls only faked a small percentage of the events.
Interesting.
The documentary even points out that poltergeists only have a limited number of tricks, like they have a set repertoire. So maybe the girls were just copying what they'd already seen.
Makes sense. But even with some faking, there was still a lot of unexplained stuff.
Yeah.
The documentary mentions matches spontaneously bursting into flames, the girls getting thrown from their beds.
That armchair was still doing its thing, too, flipping over right in front of Grosse in broad daylight.
Yeah, that's hard to explain away. But as the investigation continued, some doubts started to creep in about Maurice Grosse. Some people felt he was getting too close to the family and was too quick to believe everything they said.
Yeah, the skeptical journalist Ian Banks thought Grosse was seeing what he wanted to see.
It's easy to get caught up in it, especially when you're dealing with something so mysterious. The documentary even mentions that Gross had recently lost his daughter, also named Janet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Some people wondered if his grief was influencing his beliefs. Maybe he was looking for proof of an afterlife.
That's a heartbreaking thought, and it's
Yeah.
something to consider.
It is. And then there's the frustrating lack of video evidence. They tried to capture things on camera, but the equipment kept malfunctioning.
Flash going off randomly, recorders breaking down. It's like the poltergeist was camera shy.
The documentary mentions that if they'd had today's technology, we might have clearer answers. Imagine 24/7 live streaming of a haunted house.
Now that would be must-see TV.
Right. But even without the video, there were still those unexplained things. The knocking sounds, the fires, the curtains moving with windows closed.
It's those little details that keep you thinking.
They do. And as the investigation went on, the activity seemed to focus more and more on Janet.
Yeah, she was like the center of the storm.
Exactly. The documentary describes her as a normal kid, lively, well-behaved.
But she seemed to be the target of whatever was happening.
The documentary also mentions that similar incidents happened to Janet at school and even in a supermarket. So it wasn't just the house.
It's like whatever it was, it followed her.
Creepy. And both sources mention this theory that poltergeist activity is linked to puberty.
Maybe it's all those hormones going crazy.
Right. It could be a subconscious cry for help or something. And things really escalated in December of 1977.
That's when we get the infamous cushion incident.
Tell me about it.
Well, a colleague of Playfair's, kind of jokingly, asked Janet to move a cushion from upstairs to downstairs without opening the door. He was testing this idea that she could move objects through solid matter.
And what happened?
The cushion ended up on the roof. A baker who was walking by saw it and said there was nobody at the window.
So how did it get there?
That's the million-dollar question. The documentary really emphasizes how impossible it would have been for Janet or Playfair to get that cushion up there.
And then there's that story about the book, Fun and Games with Children. Ironic, right?
Totally. The book somehow teleported into the locked house next door. The neighbor confirmed it.
Another impossible feat. And then, of course, we have the levitation.
Janet's claim to fame.
It reportedly started with her sliding around in bed and then escalated to her actually levitating.
There are those famous photos that Graham Morris took. They're a bit blurry, but you can see something happening.
Morris swore they were real, but he also admitted that they wouldn't convince everyone. It's like pics or it didn't happen, right?
Exactly. But then we have other people who saw Janet levitating. A lollipop lady and some other people claimed they saw her floating past the window from the street.
Multiple witnesses. That's hard to ignore. And then there's the voice.
The creepy voice.
Janet started talking in this deep male voice.
The People article talks about how she seemed to be in a trance when it happened.
And the documentary goes into all this detail about how speech therapists were baffled. They did a laryngograph analysis, which basically studies voice patterns.
And they found that she was using her false vocal cords to make the sound.
I didn't even know we had false vocal cords.
Right. And she could do it for long periods without her voice getting hoarse, which is unusual.
So some people thought she was faking it, but she's just putting on a gruff voice.
Right. But the documentary mentions that a professional ventriloquist actually looked into it.
Really?
Yeah, Ray Allen. He looked at recordings of Janet's voice and said it wasn't traditional ventriloquism.
Wow, that's interesting. So if it wasn't Janet, who was it?
Well, the voice claimed to be a former resident of the house, Bill Wilkins. He said he died in a chair downstairs after going blind.
Creepy. And this documentary mentions that Bill's son actually contacted Maurice Gross after reading Playfair's book about the case.
And he confirmed the details about his father's death. The blindness, the location, stuff the Hodgsons couldn't have known.
Whoa. That's pretty compelling evidence.
It is. But the documentary does point out that there could be other explanations. Maybe the girls overheard neighbors talking about Bill Wilkins.
Or maybe they just made it up.
Yeah. And it's worth noting that a lot of what the voice said was just gibberish or obscene stuff.
Not exactly a chatty ghost.
Right. But as things went on, even Gross started having doubts. The documentary talks about how the family was really relying on him and Playfair, and there was this tension with the SPR.
The SPR wasn't fully on board with everything.
Not really. They thought Gross and Playfair were too close to the case. The SPR even set up a whole committee to re-examine everything, including the investigators' methods.
That's got to sting a little.
Yeah. And in July 1978, Janet was admitted to the hospital for observation.
Did they find anything wrong with her?
Nope. The psychiatrist said she was physically and mentally healthy.
So no easy explanations there.
No. And the documentary mentions that there was a quiet period while the family was on holiday. But when Mrs. Hodgson's brother, John Birkin, house sat, things started up again.
The poltergeist missed them.
Apparently, John reported a door opening and closing on its own and even seeing a man sitting at the kitchen table.
What? Did he talk to the man?
He didn't stick around to find out. The man vanished when he blinked, and John was so terrified he ran out of the house.
I don't blame him.
The documentary does say that the family reported seeing more apparitions later on, but those accounts were met with more skepticism.
Like they had to keep upping the ante.
Maybe. They tried all sorts of things to end the activity. A Unitarian minister, prayers, even spiritist stuff.
Like an exorcism.
Kind of. And then in September 1978, a Dutch medium named Donna visited. She spent some time in Janet's room and said the poltergeist was gone.
And it worked.
Yeah, the activity stopped after that. It's possible that the power of suggestion played a role. After all that time, maybe everyone, including the poltergeist, was ready for it to be over.
I guess even poltergeists get tired.
Maybe. The main takeaways seem to be that it was the family, not the house, that was the focus. There were no reports of anything strange happening in the house before the Hodgsons moved in.
So it was all about Janet.
Pretty much. The documentary talks about how unpredictable poltergeists are. There are all sorts of theories about them being manifestations of human frustration or some unknown energy, but nobody really knows for sure. There was one tiny outbreak 6 months later and then nothing.
The poltergeist finally moved on.
It seems that way. The documentary wraps up by talking about how the Enfield case had a huge impact. It really fueled public interest in the paranormal.
Yeah, Enfield is one of those famous cases out there.
Definitely. And it really affected the Hodgson family. Mrs. Hodgson was apparently troubled by it for the rest of her life.
Yeah, it must have been a lot to deal with.
Yeah. So what does it all mean? Well, after all this, the Enfield poltergeist is still a mystery.
We've got eyewitness accounts, some spooky photos, but also some admitted fakery.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
It is. Hopefully this deep dive has given you all the info so you can decide for yourself what to believe.
That's right. We're not here to tell you what to think.
Exactly. But here's something to ponder. In this crazy mix of the ordinary and the bizarre, what does Enfield tell us about the nature of belief itself?
How much is real? How much is suggestion? And what about our fascination with the unexplained? What is it about those bumps in the night that keep us coming back for more?
Good questions. And if you want to explore this case even further, you can check out the photographs, read Playfair's book, and see what other paranormal enthusiasts are saying.
The mystery of Enfield lives on.
It sure does.